In the winter of 1989, a snowstorm swept across New York City. Outside a public hospital, a black luxury car pulled up, paused for less than a minute, and drove off into the cold. Left behind was a newborn baby girl, swaddled in a cheap blanket, crying on the steps. There was no name, no family, no explanation, only a torn note tucked inside that read, "Can't stay the man be." But that baby didn't disappear. She survived. Raised by Alina Johnson, a black nurse with more heart than money, the child, named Hope, grew. 35 years later, the tides turned. Charles, now bankrupt, disgraced, and desperate, walked into a towering bank he never imagined he'd need, Hope Capital. He came begging for a loan. Sitting at the head of the boardroom table was the woman he had once left behind, now the CEO of the very empire that could save or end him. This isn't just a story of revenge. It's a story about rising from the ashes, reclaiming identity, and turning abandonment into absolute power. Stay with us, because what comes next will change the way you see legacy, race, and justice forever. It was a bitter December evening in 1989 when Charles Whitmore made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Snow fell like ash from a sky the color of steel, and New York City seemed quieter than usual, hushed by the cold and the weight of secrets. A sleek black limousine pulled up to the emergency entrance of Harlem Memorial Hospital, far from the glossy private clinics Charles typically frequented. The driver didn't even kill the engine. Inside the backseat, Charles stared at the tiny bundle in his arms. A baby girl, barely a week old, with skin the color of warm earth and eyes that hadn't yet learned to distrust the world. She looked nothing like him. And that was part of the problem. Her mother had been one of the executive assistants at his real estate firm. Brilliant, beautiful, black, and inconvenient. The pregnancy had been a nightmare Charles couldn't buy his way out of. He had tried, offered her hush money, a penthouse, relocation, but she refused. Said she wanted her child to know her father. That was never in his plan. When she died suddenly during labor, Charles saw his escape hatch. The child was now his problem, one he didn't want. He didn't name her. He didn't kiss her goodbye. He barely looked at her as he tucked a folded note into her blanket, 2 words scribbled in haste, "Can't stay." And then he rang the hospital bell and slid back into the leather interior of his limousine, vanishing into the Manhattan night. No one knew who he was. He'd made sure of that. Inside the hospital, chaos met the child's arrival. The nurses were overwhelmed, underpaid, and overworked. Babies weren't supposed to arrive anonymously, not in real life. But then came Nurse Alina Johnson, mid-40s, strong-willed, tired-eyed, with the kind of maternal instinct that didn't need a reason. She took one look at the child and whispered, "You're not a mistake, baby. You're a miracle someone was too blind to see." Alina had seen enough abandonment in her lifetime to recognize the signs. The quick drop-off, the lack of information. The state would call it a safe surrender, but she called it what it was, desertion. And yet, something about this baby pulled at her. Maybe it was the way she clenched her tiny fists like she was already fighting. Maybe it was because Alina had lost a child years ago and never really healed. Or maybe it was because, deep down, she knew the world wouldn't be kind to this little black girl unless someone stepped in. So she did. Alina took the baby home temporarily, but temporary turned into weeks, then months. The adoption process was slow and grueling. Racial bureaucracy always is. But Alina was persistent. She named the baby Hope, not because she was optimistic, but because she believed in giving what she never had herself. Hope grew up in a small 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat. There were leaks in the ceiling and sirens at night, but there was also love, and plenty of it. Alina worked doubles to afford school uniforms and peanut butter sandwiches, often coming home with aching feet and a tired smile. She read to Hope every night from borrowed library books, especially the ones about women who changed the world. "That's going to be you one day," she'd whisper, "but smarter, stronger." Meanwhile, just a few miles away, Charles Whitmore was becoming richer, colder, and more powerful. He was featured on the cover of Forbes, bought his third yacht, and gave lectures about self-made success while burying any trace of his past. The secret child he left at the hospital was nothing more than a distant blur, easily forgotten in the noise of his empire. In his world, mistakes could be erased with money. People were either assets or liabilities. He didn't even know her name. Hope, however, grew up with questions. Why did she look different from the other kids in her class? Why were there no pictures of her father? Why did people sometimes look at her and assume the worst? Alina told her the truth in pieces, small, gentle truths that left room for the bigger ones to arrive later. "Your daddy wasn't ready," she once said, "but that don't mean you weren't worthy." Hope carried those words like armor. By the time she was 10, she was reading at a high school level. By 13, she could outpace her math teacher. By 16, she had her first job filing loan paperwork at a local credit union, fascinated by the way money moved, how it opened doors or kept them closed. She watched how people with poor credit were treated like criminals, while the wealthy were handed golden parachutes. It lit a fire in her, not of anger, of purpose. At school, she faced the subtle but cutting racism of lowered expectations. Teachers told her she was articulate and surprisingly ambitious. Guidance counselors tried to steer her toward realistic goals, but Alina always reminded her, "They don't get to decide your story. You do." The truth about her origins didn't come fully into view until she turned 18 and requested her unsealed adoption records. What she found was cold, clinical. Her birth mother's name, Amara Hughes, was there, along with the tragic note about her death. But the father's name line was left blank. Still, there was one clue, a surveillance photo from the hospital's old security system, badly pixelated, but just clear enough to show a tall white man stepping into a limousine. It wasn't much, but it was enough to start asking questions. She went to the library, dug through real estate investment journals, found a face that matched the photo: Charles Whitmore, billionaire, real estate magnate, kingmaker, her father. Hope didn't cry, she didn't scream. She just stared at his face for hours, trying to find traces of herself in it, and coming up empty. He looked like every man who'd ever ignored her on the street, every man who'd locked his car door when she passed by, every man who built skyscrapers in black neighborhoods and never thought to ask what stood there before. That night, Hope made a vow. She wouldn't chase him, she wouldn't ask for anything, but she would rise, and one day he'd know exactly who she was. Hope never confronted Charles. She never sent him a letter, never made a phone call, never even whispered his name to anyone but herself. Not because she wasn't angry. She was. There were nights she lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling of her bedroom, wondering how a man could walk away from his own child and sleep soundly for decades. But she knew something deeper than rage, something colder, sharper. She knew that the best kind of justice wasn't loud. It was earned. It was undeniable. And when it came, it left no doubt. So she got to work. She applied to colleges with trembling fingers and a heart full of doubt. Most of her friends were going local, community colleges, jobs, trade schools. But Hope had other plans. She aimed high and wrote her essays with brutal honesty. She didn't sugarcoat her life. She wrote about abandonment, about growing up black and fatherless, about how the financial system was built to fail people like her, and how she planned to break it open from the inside. She got a full ride to Columbia. The first day on campus, she stood in front of Low Library and just breathed. This world was not built for her. She could feel it in the way the professors pronounced her name like it was unfamiliar, in the way her classmates asked what neighborhood she was from with that subtle, coded curiosity. But she didn't care. She wasn't there to belong. She was there to dominate. While others went to parties, Hope went to office hours. While some students used fake IDs to get into bars, she was sneaking into finance seminars meant for alumni. She studied late, worked weekends, and interned every summer, often without pay, just to get closer to the game. And what she found in those glossy boardrooms and polished conference halls didn't surprise her. It was the same story told in different suits, wealthy men deciding the fate of people they'd never meet. But Hope wasn't there to complain. She was there to learn the rules and then bend them. By the time she graduated, she already had 2 job offers on the table. Not because of her name, not because of legacy or donations, but because of sheer grit. She chose a boutique investment firm in Brooklyn that focused on turning around failing Black-owned businesses. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. She worked under a woman named Carla Mendes, a no-nonsense CFO who saw Hope for exactly what she was, a storm in a calm suit. Carla taught her how to read balance sheets like novels, how to spot a dying company 3 quarters in advance, how to talk to CEOs like you owned the room, even if you were 23, Black and female. Hope absorbed it all. She arrived early, stayed late, and started to build a reputation for making impossible numbers make sense. But ambition doesn't sleep. After 4 years, she jumped to a hedge fund in Midtown, one of the big ones. It was a world of tailored suits, $5,000 watches, and silent elevators. She was the only Black woman on her floor, sometimes the only woman, period. She dealt with being called aggressive for having an opinion. She saw men with less experience get better deals. She once had a managing partner mistake her for the receptionist, but she didn't quit. She knew her presence alone was a disruption. At 28, she was made vice president, the youngest in the company's history. She took meetings with CEOs twice her age and held her own. She turned failing investments into profits. She wasn't just smart, she was strategic. And somewhere along the way, her name began circulating in rooms she'd never even entered. One of those rooms belonged to a mid-sized commercial bank struggling after a botched acquisition. The board needed fresh vision. They offered Hope a chance to join as chief strategy officer. It was a risk, a lateral move in title, but not in power. She said yes. By 32, she wasn't just turning profits, she was turning heads. She initiated programs to expand lending to minority-owned businesses. She opened financial literacy programs in underfunded schools, and she made the bank profitable doing it. The press called her a unicorn. Wall Street called her a disruptor. But she knew what she really was, prepared. When the opportunity came to buy the struggling bank outright during a merger, she didn't blink. She called it Hope Capital. People thought the name was symbolic. In truth, it was personal, every letter of it. She signed the paperwork with a pen a leaner had given her on the day she graduated from college. "Use this to sign your future," the note had said. Now she was the future. With ownership came control. She moved the headquarters to Harlem, put a leaner's portrait in the boardroom, hired women and people of color to lead departments they were usually locked out of. She didn't just want to play the game, she wanted to redesign the board. And it worked. Hope Capital began outperforming banks 5 times its size. Customers flocked to a company that actually cared about their communities. Investors followed. Within a year, Hope Capital was no longer a novelty. It was a force. And then came the moment she never expected. The email. It was a loan request from a shell company, hidden in layers of real estate holdings connected to none other than Charles Whitmore, the man who once left her at a hospital door without a name. His empire had crumbled under the weight of greed, lawsuits, and changing tides. The once invincible billionaire was drowning, and the only lifeline left was hers. Hope stared at the request for a long time. She didn't cry. She didn't laugh. She didn't even feel anger. She felt peace, because she knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of her version. It began with a knock on the glass. Hope looked up from her desk, the Manhattan skyline casting long shadows across the oak-paneled office behind her. Her assistant stepped in quietly, a folder in her hand, and a look on her face that Hope had learned to recognize, a mixture of confusion and hesitation. "There's a walk-in requesting a meeting with you. No appointment, but he says it's urgent. Name's Charles Whitmore." For a moment, Hope didn't move. The name sat heavy in the air like smoke from a long-forgotten fire. It wasn't unfamiliar. She had seen it on building permits, business headlines, real estate plaques. She had once seen it on a security tape in a hospital archive. It was the name of a man who had vanished from her life before he ever entered it. A man who had defined her absence. She closed the file she was reading, took a deep breath and said, "Send him in." He walked slower than she expected. The Charles Whitmore standing in front of her wasn't the man from the magazines. Not the arrogant mogul with silver cufflinks and a gleaming smile. This man was older, thinner, his suit expensive but tired, his eyes dimmed with something that looked suspiciously like regret. He introduced himself with a small bow of the head, not realizing that she already knew everything about him, more than he probably remembered about himself. "Miss Johnson," he began, voice rasping with forced charm. "Thank you for seeing me. I didn't expect this directly. I usually speak to boards or partners." "I'm both," she replied smoothly. "Have a seat." He did slowly. She let the silence sit there for a moment, just long enough for it to become uncomfortable. Let him feel the weight of it. He shuffled slightly in his chair, cleared his throat, and finally laid a document on her desk, a financing request. A loan, a large one. Hope flipped through it, keeping her expression unreadable. The numbers were clear. Whitmore Industries, once a titan, was sinking fast. He needed help, and he needed it now. "You've come to Hope Capital," she said slowly. "Why?" He hesitated. "Your firm, your reputation. Your new blood, smart, flexible, not bound by some of the legacy grudges and politics of the old banking world." She raised an eyebrow. "And yet you are that old world." Charles chuckled weakly. "Fair enough." Hope folded her hands. "Tell me what happened." He sighed. "Real estate collapsed. The markets turned. Lawsuits from former partners. Everything I built is crumbling, and I need backing fast." Hope leaned back, watching him. This man, who once held the world by its throat, now sat before her, humbled, desperate, unaware. She wondered how many women like her he'd ignored over the years, how many lives he'd built his fortune on, how many daughters he'd left behind. Still, she said nothing about their connection. Not yet. Instead, she stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, letting her silence speak for her. After a moment, she turned back, arms folded. "Do you remember Harlem Memorial?" she asked. He blinked. "Excuse me." 1989. December, snow on the ground. You left something there. His brow furrowed. I don't follow." "You left a baby, wrapped in a hospital blanket. No name, just a note." The color drained from his face. She stepped closer, her voice steady but sharp. "You didn't even look at her. You just walked away." Charles swallowed hard, leaning forward as if to say something, but no words came. Hope dropped the folder in front of him. "I was that baby." The silence that followed wasn't just awkward, it was annihilating. He stared at her like she was a ghost, like the past had materialized into a reckoning in a tailored suit and heels. You, you're. I'm Hope Johnson, raised by Alina Johnson, the nurse who found me, the woman who chose me when you didn't. His hands trembled. I didn't know, I thought, that I'd vanish. Her tone cut through him like glass. That if you walked away fast enough, the consequences wouldn't follow. That I'd never grow up, never get strong, never learn the rules of your world. I was scared, he said quietly. You were a coward, she corrected. And now you need help from the same life you refuse to acknowledge. He looked down. For the first time, the great Charles Whitmore had no pitch, no spin, no exit strategy. But Hope wasn't finished. I built this company, she said, her voice rising slightly, not with anger but with the power of truth. I built it from nothing, from a broken crib and a borrowed name. And while you were climbing towers made of greed, I was building foundations made of grit. So don't sit there and tell me you didn't know. You chose not to know. Charles nodded slowly, like a man being sentenced. I'm not here to punish you, Hope said. I don't need to. Life already did that, but I will decide what happens next. He looked up. So, is that a no? Hope picked up the folder, tapped it closed, and held it in her hands for a moment. Then she walked over to the shredder in the corner and fed it in, one page at a time. She didn't flinch as the machine devoured his plea. You left me with nothing, she said calmly. I will leave you with nothing in return. Charles stood, but she stopped him with a gesture. I suggest you remember this moment, she said, because it's the last time your decisions won't define someone else's future. He opened his mouth to speak, maybe to apologize, maybe to beg again, but nothing came. So he simply nodded, turned, and walked out of her office. She didn't watch him go. Instead, she returned to her desk, picked up the next file, and moved forward. Because that's what survivors do. After Charles left her office, the silence that followed wasn't one of satisfaction. It was something else. Not relief. Not revenge. Not even closure. It was stillness. The kind that only comes after a storm when the world is momentarily still, waiting to see what you'll do next. Hope sat in her chair, staring at the door he had walked through just minutes earlier, feeling empty. She had imagined this moment for most of her life. What she'd say, how she'd say it. The way she'd make him feel small, cornered, powerless. And yes, she'd done it. She had denied him. She had looked him in the eye and watched the realization break across his face like waves on glass. But now, sitting in the quiet of that towering office, she realized something deeper. Vengeance wasn't as satisfying as people believed. Not when you'd already won long ago. She hadn't needed to humiliate him. His own choices had done that. The real victory wasn't shredding his loan documents. It was the life she had built, the name she had made for herself, the empire standing under her name, not his. That was the true reckoning. That evening, Hope went home to Alina's old apartment. Yes, she still kept it. She de-remodeled it, of course, modernized the kitchen and updated the wiring, but she never sold it. She couldn't. It was more than drywall and chipped paint. It was the birthplace of her becoming. It smelled like old books and lavender, like safety. She sat at the tiny kitchen table where she once did homework under a flickering ceiling light and opened Alina's old recipe box. Inside, buried under faded index cards and newspaper clippings, was a yellowed envelope with her name on it. Her full name, Hope Amara Johnson. Alina had written it the week Hope turned 16. The envelope contained no money, no legal documents, just a letter. Short, simple, honest. My baby girl, I knew you'd make it. Not because of what they said, but because I saw the fire in your eyes every time someone told you no. You don't owe this world revenge. You owe it your brilliance. Give what they never gave you. That's how we heal. That's how we win. Hope cried that night. Not the kind of cry that bends you in half, but the kind that softens you, like rain on dry soil. She realized she didn't want to be the woman who held grudges in gold-plated offices. She wanted to be the woman who opened doors that had once been slammed in her face. The next morning, she drafted a proposal, not to the board, not to investors, but to herself. She called it the Billionaire Initiative. The goal was bold but clear: to make banking accessible, human, and empowering, especially for the people this system had overlooked, marginalized, or outright abandoned. She began by opening microloan centers in underserved neighborhoods. No credit check, no bureaucratic nightmares, just trust, mentorship, and education. She offered startup capital to young Black entrepreneurs who had the ideas but not the networks. She funded community programs that taught financial literacy to teenagers, especially girls. She went back to Harlem Memorial, the hospital where it had all begun, and personally cut the ribbon on a new wing, the Hope Center for Equity in Finance and Care. It included free clinics, housing counselors, even job training for single parents. When asked why she invested there instead of Wall Street, her answer was simple: because legacy starts where life almost ended. Hope didn't just write checks. She showed up, in sneakers and blazers, with notebooks and coffee. She sat in rooms with single mothers, formerly incarcerated men, undocumented immigrants, and she listened. Really listened. She didn't believe in saviorism. She believed in access. People don't need rescuing, she said in one int. The media took notice. Features in Time, Forbes, and The Atlantic praised her as a pioneer of ethical capitalism. But Hope never saw herself as a hero. She saw herself as a continuation of Eleanor, of Amara, of every little girl told she wasn't enough. And what about Charles? Months passed. He never returned, never wrote, never apologized. Hope sometimes saw his name in the business obituaries, his companies falling, one after another. One day she read he had sold his mansion in Greenwich. Another day that he'd been sued by former partners. And finally, a short buried note that he had passed away in hospice. No public funeral, no heirs list. Hope felt complicated, not grief, not joy, just stillness again. The closing of a door that had already been shut years before. One afternoon, a lawyer reached out on behalf of the Whitmore estate. There was a safe deposit box with her name on it. No will, no formal recognition, just a box. Inside was a photograph, grainy and faded, of Amara Hughes, her birth mother, smiling in a sunlit park. On the back, written in ink, "She was braver than me." And folded underneath it, a check, blank, signed by Charles Whitmore. Hope stared at it, then ripped it in half. She didn't need his money. She had her own. But she kept the photo. Later that year, Hope stood on the stage of an urban high school, handing out scholarships to students who reminded her of herself, scrappy, bright-eyed, ready to fight the world and win. One girl asked her during the Q&A, "How did you forgive him? How did you move on?" Hope paused, then smiled gently. "I didn't forgive him for him," she said. "I forgave him so I could breathe, so I could build, so I wouldn't spend my life carrying a man who couldn't carry me for a single day." The crowd was silent. Then it erupted in applause. Hope walked off stage that night knowing she had finally crossed a threshold, not just of success, but of peace. Her story wasn't about a man who left her. It was about the woman she became because he did. The room was full: press, students, community leaders, even a few skeptics. Hope stood at the podium of the annual Hope Capital Forum, her signature event designed not for shareholders but for changemakers. Behind her, a giant screen flashed an image of a simple timeline: 1989, present. Beneath it, 3 words: abandoned, empowered, unstoppable. She looked out over the crowd and took a breath. This wasn't just another speech. It was a moment, a reflection, a full circle. 35 years ago, she began, a decision was made that could have ended a life. a decision made in fear, in cowardice, in silence. But instead of ending something, it began everything. The audience was silent, leaning in. I wasn't given a name that day. I wasn't given a trust fund. I wasn't even given a chance. But I was given something more powerful, a woman who saw me not as a burden but as a beginning. Her name was Eleanor Johnson. She didn't share my blood. She didn't have a fortune. But she gave me something most people can't afford to give: belief. Hope paused, letting her eyes scan the room. You see, we're told so often that our past defines us, that where we came from dictates where we go. But I'm here to tell you the truth. We are not the products of our pain. We are the architects of our purpose. A quiet murmur of agreement rippled through the audience. People ask me if I ever think about him, the man who left me, she continued. And the answer is no, not often, because my story isn't about him. My story is about every person who's ever been told they were unwanted and turned that into fuel. About every girl who had to learn her worth from scratch. About every young man who walked into a bank and was told no before anyone read his plan. About anyone who has ever been counted out and decided to count themselves in. Applause began to build, but she held up her hand just slightly to quiet the room again. Hope isn't just my name. It's a strategy. It's a decision we make daily to believe in better, to build it when it doesn't exist, and to give it when no one ever gave it to us. She stepped away from the podium slowly, her voice softening but never weakening. Today, I don't stand here as the child of a billionaire. I stand here as the product of a nurse's love, a city's struggle, and a woman's will. I stand here not to be applauded, but to remind you, the most powerful thing you can do is show up for yourself. The lights dimmed slightly as a video montage began behind her, footage of children learning to budget in Hope Capital literacy classes, single mothers launching small businesses, elderly clients opening their first savings accounts. The music was gentle, rising like morning sun. And finally, the last image faded in. Hope herself, holding hands with a group of teenagers outside a new financial center, smiling. Not like a CEO, not like a public figure, but like someone who had finally come home. As the screen faded to black, the words appeared one last time. They tried to bury her, but she was a seed. The audience rose in silence. Some clapped, some wiped away tears, but all of them felt something that wouldn't leave them for a long time. Hope walked off stage, not to applause, but to legacy. Because sometimes the most beautiful revenge is a life well lived.